I welcome two special guests present on our call. Indonesia's new ambassador in Washington, Mohammed Lutfi, and USINDO's Indonesia co-chair, Pak Theo Sambuaga. Thank you both for joining. Today's topic is our most riveting current interest area, and somehow made even more so by the debates the other night. The 2020 presidential election, outlook, issues, and significance for U.S. domestic and foreign policy. This event is part of USINDO's special election open forum series, which also covers Indonesian presidential elections, and it's been going on for at least 10 years. The U.S. presidential election 1 month from now is more consequential than any in recent American history, even going back decades. The two candidates have sharply differing views, styles, temperaments, and domestic and foreign policy positions. They have profoundly different views on governance, including the role of the presidency in relation to Congress, the courts, state governors, and the press. They differ sharply on America's role in the world and models of engagement with other countries. These differences between the candidates are also playing out against the backdrop of an increasingly polarized American electorate divided on a large list of issues. People's motivations for voting range from support for their party's candidate to preventing the victory of the other party's candidate and everything in between. Meanwhile, the very legitimacy of the electoral process has become a highly debated topic as well. And some of the permutations of that can keep you up at night. We seem to be headed for knowing the outcome only well after Election Day. Today, with all of this weightiness of the election and interest, we're very fortunate to have two distinguished expert speakers, both of whom I've happened to know for a very long time. First, Mr. Casimir Yost, Senior Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, Georgetown University. He was former senior staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the Republican side for about a decade, where I first met him. Welcome, Cas.
Thank you.
Dr. Jonah Blank, Senior Political Scientist at the RAND Corporation. Jonah was also former senior staff of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee for over a decade, but on the Democratic side. Thus, as usual, USINDO has tried its best to make political issues nicely balanced. We are a neutral organization. Mr. Yost will brief us for 15 minutes on the outlook based on the latest polls and analysis of the key factors. And then Mr. Yost will brief us for 15 minutes on the issues. Both of these will be followed by brief comments by Dr. Blank. Then Dr. Blank will speak for 15 minutes on the significance of this election for domestic and foreign policy with comments by Mr. Yost. We will wrap up with a Q&A period. Questions submitted via the Q&A link it's the only place we're going to look, will be selected for reply. So let's get started. Cas, please.
Thank you so much, and I'm delighted to be with you and with your guests all the way from Idaho, where I'm currently situated. Let me begin on a personal note. I have been to your wonderful country many, many, many times. My daughter spent 7 years with my grandchildren in Ubud in Bali. And so I had the occasion, my wife and I both had the occasion to visit Indonesia many times. And I have, in fact, had the opportunity to come as an election observer some many years ago on a delegation headed by former President Jimmy Carter. And so I've also had the opportunity to see how your election system operates. So it's a particular pleasure for me to talk to you about our upcoming elections. We're just over 30 days out, but we know from prior experience that a lot can happen in the final 30 days of an election. And just how uncertain the outcome is captured by the chaotic debate that some of you may have witnessed between President Trump and former Vice President Biden. I should probably say that for many Americans, including me, and I suspect Jonah, it was an embarrassing experience. Debates traditionally have been an opportunity for the American people to watch the candidates lay out the issues in a careful and systematic way. But unfortunately, at least in this first debate, that opportunity was not exercised. So let me dive in to the outlook. If the election were held today, all of the polling indicates that former Vice President Biden would be the winner of the election. But as I noted at the outset, we've got over a month, and so I'm not going to predict the outcome for you. What I will say is that Mr. Biden's advantage has been constant now for some extended period of time, both at the national level, but more importantly, at the state level. As you know, our elections are conducted at the state level, and some states, as I will come to in more detail, are more important than others. Nobody doubts that Vice President Biden will win in the state of, to pick one, California. It seems very unlikely that Mr. Biden will win in the state of Texas. And so some states are going to be more important than others, and I'll come to that in a moment. But let me begin by talking about some of the major uncertainties that I think we face in the days ahead until we get to Election Day on November 3rd. First of all, we have a sitting president. So this election is, to a large extent, a referendum election. Referendum on Mr. Biden's almost 4 years in office, Mr. Trump's almost 4 years in office, and how the American people feel about that. Second, another key uncertainty is this is the first election, quite obviously, held in the COVID-19 era. The question, under a normal circumstance, we would anticipate that voters would line up at the voting booth in large numbers on Election Day. But we know now that in the COVID era, many more people than has been true in the past are going to be voting by mail. We have experience in this country with mail-in voting. I'm at present in the state of Idaho. Just below me, the state of Utah votes only by mail. So there's extended experience with this, but as I say, in a COVID era, there are some uncertainties related to to voting by mail. And the president actually has made this one of the issues in his campaign. And then the third uncertainty is the role of money. Again, a source of some embarrassment to Americans, the massive amounts of money that both of these candidates will be spending on this election. Money that goes for staffing, but money that goes for advertising as well. So let me dive into some of the details here. The election is for federal office, for the president, for the vice president, and then for members of the Senate and the Congress. But each state, each individual state, and the District of Columbia, Washington, manages the elections. And so this is an election that will be decided in 51 different jurisdictions, 50 states plus the District of Columbia. We know that the polling indicates that as of today, anywhere from 3 to 5% of the American people electorate say that they are undecided. So that when you strip away all of the argumentation, particularly if this is going to be a very close election, we're talking about a relatively few number of people in a relatively few number of states that will decide the future of the American presidency. President Trump, whose base has been remarkably loyal and remarkably stable, somewhere between 40 to 45% of the electorate is appealing to a very concentrated number of people. And what the pundits, the observers say is that his base electoral support are white men without college degrees, evangelical Christians, and rural voters. When President Trump wakes up every morning, he is paying attention to these different categories of voters. When Vice President Biden wakes up every morning, he is thinking very much about ethnic minorities, African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans. He's thinking about college-educated voters, and he's focused on cities and suburbs. And so when you look at the map of the United States, a large portion of which, of course, is rural, this is where President Trump and Republicans are making their appeals. But then when you narrow that map down to look at Democrats, you'll see that cities form an important constituency for Mr. Biden. Under our system, each state has a minimum of 3 electoral votes, but the larger states, the electoral votes are divided according to population. And so the state of Wyoming, which is right next to where I am now, has 3 electoral votes. The state of California has 55 electoral votes, again, based on population. If you take us, and the needed number is 270. If you take a snapshot today, depending on who, which observer you're quoting. The Democrats have safely around 200 electoral votes, and the Republicans have safely around 125. And so, if you're a Democrat, you have a much easier path to election victory. If you're a Republican, you have to struggle to put together the 270 electoral votes. Now, having said that, when we were talking about this 4 years ago in 2016, and in fact, I had the opportunity to come and speak in Indonesia about our election prospects before the 2016 election. There was a lot of confidence that, particularly among Democrats, that Hillary Clinton was going to be the president of the United States. And a month out, she too was ahead in the polls. Well, we know how that ended. Now President Trump was able to put together a coalition of states, surprise Democrats in several key states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and pulled out the election. But as of today, and the way you can determine which states matter the most is by simply looking at the travel schedule of Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden. So they are traveling, those two candidates, and this is where their campaigns are putting their money, to Florida, to Pennsylvania, to Wisconsin, to Ohio, to Arizona. These are the states where these two candidates will be spending the bulk of their time over the course of the next 30 plus days. There are a few others, North Carolina, Arizona, where advertising is heavy. But as you look at the election map coming up, those are the states that you as observers should be focused on, because those are the states that Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump will be devoting their attention to. Let me stop there and turn over to Jonah to elaborate or differ with my analysis.
Thank you, Kaz. Jonah, please.
Terima kasih banyak telah mengganggang saya. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to speak with old friends. A little bit of background briefly. I am right now sitting in Singapore, but from 2018 until just a couple of months ago, I lived in Indonesia with my family, and I have been covering Indonesia on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and now for RAND from essentially from the very time for this entire century, and even a little bit before. So it is always a pleasure to be invited and to be among friends. Thank you, Kaz, as well, for an excellent presentation. I will only add a couple of points since I believe I only have 5 minutes for this segment. One, a disclaimer. For 9 years in government, my boss was a fellow named Joe Biden. So I am not completely impartial in my analysis. However, I do not speak for the Biden campaign, and I will earnestly try to be as straightforward as I can. Second is I was fortunate enough to observe the last election, the 2019 election in Indonesia, in Jogja. And I even wrote an article about it for Foreign Affairs as an example of how Indonesia has really not only progressed in Indonesian terms, but is a world leader in showing the rest of the world how democracy can work. And without, as my old boss would say, I'm not being solicitous here, he likes to say that, I genuinely believe that the voting procedures that I saw in Jakarta and in Yogyakarta would give me more confidence in democracy in Indonesia than in my own home country. I think we could learn a lot from Indonesia. So next time someone comes and lectures you about democracy, them a lecture back. The main asterisk I would put to Kaz's excellent presentation about the mechanics of the Electoral College is that right now, from at least 2016 until the present and for the foreseeable future, the Electoral College has a very strong partisan lean. It wasn't always that way. It may not be that way in the future, but right now it leans very strongly Republican. And there are a lot of institutional reasons for that that I can get into and can put up a lot of slides explaining it. But the short answer is that in the 20th century, there have been 3 US presidents elected. 2 of those 3 were elected for the first time while losing the popular vote, George Bush and Donald Trump. They both got fewer votes and yet became president because that's how our system works. It's an electoral college rather than a direct election. This is almost certainly going to be the case if Mr. Trump were to win again. Even his advisors are not seriously expecting him to win the popular vote. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won 3 million more votes, but she did not win the Electoral College. And this time, too, all of the best projections are that Joe Biden would need to win the popular vote by at least 4% just to have a 50-50 shot at winning the Electoral College. To have something like a 95% chance, he'd have to win the popular vote by about 7%, which is really rather a big victory. So everyone is calculating on this. No one is expecting it to be different. And in 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, maybe the map will favor the Democrats. But it's important to remember that right now, the Electoral College has a baked-in Republican advantage. The last point I'd make, because you'll be seeing a lot of maps over the next few months or so, a lot of them will have a lot of splotches of red and splotches of blue for Republican 1 seats and Democratic 1 seats. Even though I am sitting here in front of a rather large red painting by the Indonesian painter Wayan Damrekam, I worked for the Democratic side of the aisle. I would just want to remind you that these maps represent geography rather than people. Just as in an Indonesian election, a candidate could win all of Java and not a single seat anywhere else in Java. And the map of Indonesia would look very disproportionately in favor of the candidate who did not win Java. As we all know, 60% of Indonesia's electorate is located in Java. It's similar in America. I have some graphics I can put up during Q&A, but the point is that if you see maps with a lot of red on them, that doesn't mean that's a lot of voters. That means that's a lot of real estate. And with that, I'll turn it back.
Thank you. Please proceed with the issues for up to 15 minutes, as you see it.
So I keep confessing that Americans should be a bit embarrassed by the way we conduct our elections. And this holds true with the issues that seem to be under discussion in this election. Foreign policy, and if you watch the debates, the debate the other night, you will know foreign policy is virtually not directly on the agenda. This is an election that will be decided by voters who are essentially thinking about domestic issues and only indirectly about issues that relate to foreign policy. Obviously, the coronavirus has an international flavor to it. Issues of trade are important in this election, but fundamentally, this is an election being decided by voters that are most concerned about issues that affect their personal health and well-being, especially about fundamentally domestic issues. That said, you have two very different perspectives. Former Vice President Biden believes, argues that the solution to global problems, the issue of climate, issues of health, issues of security require cooperation with friends and allies around the world. And he believes fundamentally in the importance of strengthening our alliances. By way of contrast, President Trump has this slogan, his mantra, America first. He argues not only to Americans, but to the world in the General Assembly at the United Nations, that U.S. interests must come front and center, and that everything should be looked through the lens of American interests. And he has argued persuasively to his base that allies seek advantage of the United States, and therefore we need to be skeptical not only about our competitors, but also about our allies. To return to Mr. Biden, here are the issues that he's identified in this campaign as being of fundamental importance to his candidacy. First, COVID-19, that President Trump's, in his judgment, in Biden's judgment, President Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic has been inadequate, unhelpful to Americans who are facing this terrible pandemic. As many of you know, over 200,000 Americans have died from the coronavirus. And so Vice President Biden has been hitting the president and his team on this. Second, the issue of healthcare more broadly. The United States continues to have many Americans who are not adequately covered by healthcare, and Vice President Biden, former Vice President, is dedicated to expanding coverage for Americans for their healthcare. Third, and more recently, the issue of racial justice. You may have seen on your television screens the Black Lives Matter demonstrations around the country. This is an issue, the issue of racial equity has become front and center, particularly among Democrats. Fourth, the issue of income inequality. There is a stark statistic that I came across the other day that 3 Americans own as many assets as 160 million other Americans. 3 and 160 million. And so the issue of income inequality, which translates in Vice President Biden's reading to higher taxes on wealthy people. Fifth, climate change. Democrats have placed enormous weight on this particular issue, that it is of fundamental importance that the United States be part of the solution to the issue of climate change. We take the example of wildfires in California, hurricanes in Louisiana and Texas as examples of climate that is changing to the detriment of American citizens. And then more broadly, it's clear that former Vice President Biden and the Democratic Party is dedicated to a more expansive and expanded role for the federal government in the lives of Americans to deal with these issues that I've just laid out. Turning now to President Trump, the driving focus of his candidacy is on reviving and restoring the American economy. He takes great pride in the economic performance of the United States during the first 3 years of his presidency, and argues that if Democrats come into office, they will destroy the prospects for the American economy through higher taxes, through greater interference by the government. He argues for what he calls fair trade over free trade. He has been a critic of past trade agreements, arguing that it's resulted in large numbers of American manufacturing jobs going abroad, going to China. If I buy a refrigerator today, it's not made in America, it's made somewhere else. If I buy a car in America today, chances are it could well be made somewhere else. So President Trump and the Republicans are emphasizing this. With the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, President Trump has emphasized that these demonstrations are fostering crime and unrest in cities. He argues particularly in cities dominated by Democrats. And so he's staked his campaign on support not for the demonstrators, but for the police. He has argued that it has been his tax cuts in the past that have restored the American economy. And last but not least, on the issue of immigration, he has a much more restrictive view of how many non-Americans should be permitted to come in to the United States as immigrants and as citizens. And so one of his campaign slogans is to build a wall between Mexico and the United States. And most broadly, a more limited view of the role of government in state affairs. So as you can see, you've got two individuals running for the presidency with very, very different views of the priorities and very different concepts of where the nation should be going. Just a final word related to issues of foreign policy. Ironically, both candidates are expressing similar views when it comes to China. There is a rising tide of public opinion that is critical of China in the United States. And President Trump, and to a somewhat lesser degree, Vice President Biden has been very critical of China. A second area of agreement has been on the necessity to protect American jobs from foreign competition. Traditionally, the Republican Party has been strongly in favor of free trade, but under President Trump, it has become much more restrictive in its views. And Vice President Biden, perhaps echoing the view of progressives within his own party, has been talking more about protecting American jobs from foreign competition. Where they disagree profoundly in the foreign policy field is on Russia and on the Iran nuclear deal. On Russia, the Trump administration has been divided between hardline members of the Trump cabinet who are very critical of Russia, and the president himself, who seems ambivalent about Mr. Putin. There's no ambiguity in terms of Vice President Biden's views of Russia, of what Russia is doing, and his firm view that Russian agents are trying to interfere in American elections. And last, on the Iran nuclear deal, Mr. Biden is a strong supporter, was a strong supporter of that deal, which was concluded in the Obama administration. Mr. Trump has been a decided critic of that deal. Let me stop there, turn it over to Jonah.
Please go ahead with your comments on Kaz's presentation or additional issues that you see.
Hey, thank you. I think Kaz did a great job laying out the issues. I'd add only a few things. The first point I would make is perhaps what I would say is the most important in understanding the American election. There are a lot of issues on which Donald Trump and Joe Biden differ, but in my view, they all really cloak a fundamental difference of what kind of country America is going to be. I think the only unifying message of the Trump administration is one, and I'm going to try to put this in a neutral way if I can. A vision of America that should be geared towards people who look like me. That is basically white, particularly men, but especially people who look like me, and that these are the real Americans, and people who look like my wife and my kids are not real Americans. In my wife's case, she's a citizen of another country, so it's accurate. My sons, no, they actually are American kids. And Joe Biden's views are much more in the tradition of both parties, Democratic and Republican alike, and a lot of his positions are ones that a lot of my Republican friends actually support. I can talk more about that in my longer presentation. But I think that when Donald Trump talks about crime and law and order, when most of his supporters are not living under conditions where law and order or violent crime are really affecting them, what he's really doing is sending a message of saying, real Americans are people who look like me. Everyone else is just here on a trial basis. And that it's a powerful message. The 2016 election, if the white vote went for Donald Trump, if only white people had been able to vote, he would have won perhaps the popular vote as well. Um, and right now, there is no electoral scenario under which Joe Biden wins the election without the strong support of non-white people. Uh, this extends not just to race and ethnicity, but to religion as well. One of the underappreciated parts of the debate was where Joe Biden, under his breath, he was asked a question about the future, and he kind of said, "Inshallah," and that got some comment in America. How dare he? I think to some extent that may have been my fault because when I staffed him, I would say inshallah all the time. He would ask me, okay, you can have that memo for me? And I would say, yes, sir, inshallah. And I, uh, I explained some of the subtleties to him, and I hope that doesn't end up costing him the election. But it does get to the larger point that a lot of what I see as Donald Trump's program is really a way of signaling to his base there are real Americans who look like Jonah Blank, and there are non-real Americans who look like Jonah Blank's kids.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonah. Now, Jonah, please proceed with your presentation on the significance of this election for domestic and foreign policy.
Great. Thank you, David. I think as an American, I'll start with the domestic part first. As an American, I feel this is the most consequential election in my lifetime, maybe in anyone's lifetime since the Civil War. I don't want to overstate it, but it's hard to really express how different this election is than previous ones. People often say that. In this case, I think it's true. Donald Trump has, for better or worse, and again, I'm going to try not to make this a value judgment, but he has fundamentally changed the Republican Party. I worked in the Senate for 12 years, and I've got lots of Republican friends. I've got lots of colleagues across the aisle. Almost all of them are not supporters of the president anymore. I do have a few friends who are, including some rather surprising. One is a former strong Democrat who is now a strong Trump supporter. But it really is changing American politics in a way that we haven't seen in decades. And I think it does get to this very basic question of what kind of country America will be and how important is democracy for America. Because in the debate, Trump said very clearly that he would not accept the results of the debate unless he won. And he explicitly encouraged a violent right-wing white supremacist militia to, quote, stand by and to watch the polls. These are the sort of things that if they were occurring in Indonesia, the US State Department would put out a very stern warning about backsliding on democracy. So I think that it's important for Americans to be as aware and open-eyed and critical of our own government as we are of others. Now, on the international stage, I'll spend the rest of my time talking since I think it may be of more interest to the audience. I think that the Joe Biden foreign policy will be quite familiar to foreign audiences because it is basically the bipartisan consensus that was largely the foreign policy of Barack Obama, would have been the foreign policy of Hillary Clinton, would have been the policy of Mitt Romney, would have been the policy of John McCain. There would have been little differences around the margins, but if you just take those four figures, they were largely in alignment on the big issues. I'll wall off John McCain a little bit for his added willingness to resort to military force in certain situations. And I say that with tremendous admiration for John McCain. If he had been running against anyone other than Barack Obama, I might have broken party lines to vote for him. So I think that a Joe Biden foreign policy would be quite familiar. It would be somewhat tougher towards China than perhaps a Barack Obama presidency would have been. But I don't think that that would be coming from a position of deep-seated antagonism. It would be from the inevitability of two superpowers, one an established superpower, the other a rising superpower, virtually inevitable to come into conflict at times. That conflict doesn't have to be military, and I certainly hope that it is not. But I think that there will be some moments of tension and hopefully more cooperation than tension if Joe Biden were to be president. I think a lot of other parts of the foreign policy would be more familiar. The main thing that would be different from the current position and from perhaps some other people in the Trump Republican Party would be a renewed emphasis on partnerships and alliances. Joe Biden, I can remember from my time staffing him, is very interested in partnerships and alliances. So I think we would see a lot more outreach to our treaty allies, Japan, South Korea, just speaking within the Indo-Pacific area, the Philippines, and to our non-treaty partners like Indonesia, like Singapore, to go a little bit further afield like India. Countries with which the US has a very strong security arrangement and also economic arrangement, but which are not formal allies of the United States. These relationships are not a priority for Donald Trump. He sees them as really as a distraction. He sees things in transactional terms. And again, this isn't a value judgment. Maybe he's right. Maybe that's a better way of seeing things. But it's a very stark and perhaps one of the most important foreign policy distinctions between the two. When Trump is presented with a foreign policy question, for example, the basing of US troops in South Korea or in Japan, his immediate question is, what's in it for the United States? How much does it cost us? How does it help us? How can we renegotiate this in a way that makes a better bargain? And there are many Americans who believe that that's a better way of viewing foreign policy. Joe Biden does not see foreign policy that way, and that is not how Democrats and Republicans typically look at foreign policy. Typically, the view has been in the past that alliances and partnerships are a useful thing in of themselves, that by spreading burdens, by essentially paying it forward, we don't need to be transactional because it helps everyone. I think Cass is absolutely right that this election will not be decided on foreign policy terms, but I think that that's how some of the foreign policy will play out. The last foreign policy point that I'll make, and I'll wall off all of the foreign policy questions about Donald Trump's personal entanglements with Russia, with Ukraine, with Saudi Arabia. I'll wall those off for the question and answer. I'm more than happy to talk about them then, but I won't get into them here. The last point I would raise about foreign policy is related to domestic policy. America has such a huge role in the world stage that even America's domestic affairs become the world's affairs. If one looks at COVID, the fact that COVID is ravaging the entire planet is in no small sense due to America's mismanagement. James Fallows of The Atlantic, a magazine I write for, and also another disclosure, a former boss of mine who is also a friend. But I encourage you to read an article that James Fallow wrote about US management of COVID and comparing it to an aircraft, a plane crash. And he lays out how the global health system is really fundamentally reliant on the US health system. The American CDC, the Center for Disease Control, doesn't just manage public health for America, it very largely manages public health for the world. American support for the WHO, which Mr. Trump has ended, it keeps this organization in business. It has its flaws, but there's nothing to replace it yet, and there's nothing on the table to replace it. So America, when America bungles its COVID response, it really harms the entire world. And when America bungles its politics, it harms the entire world as well. America likes to think of itself as a beacon of democracy, and it often has been. We've seen protesters in Hong Kong waving American flags at Tiananmen Square in 1989. We saw protesters make a statue of the American Statue of Liberty. The American example has inspired people throughout the world. And America likes to think of itself as the exceptional nation and the irreplaceable nation. And to a large extent, that's true. But the reverse is true as well. When America fails to live up to its ideals, that spreads too. The fact that illiberal politics and undemocratic politics and authoritarian politics are taking root in Brazil, in Hungary, in Poland, one might say in the Philippines, one might say in a lot of other countries. This is not unrelated to the fact that these developments are happening in America, at least in my analytical view. A lot of people do take their cues from America. And for a relatively new democracy like Indonesia, I think this is important to bear in mind. I was tremendously proud when as a resident of Indonesia, when I observed the election and was able to write on it and report back to my friends in America, look at what's happening here. Look at what a wonderful job the world's fourth largest country is doing. Wouldn't it be nice if we could learn from this? I felt good when I was able to say to my American friends, you know, I've got a president who has never been accused of corruption, who's never been accused of stealing an election, who's never been accused of this or that. I live in Indonesia. It would be very tragic if people in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in any other country looked at America's recent history with democracy, however this turns out, and decides to take this as a model to follow rather than as a cautionary example to avoid. I'll leave it at that.
Kaz, you have the last comment before we go to Q&A.
So first of all, let me congratulate Jonah on his comments. I thought they were spot on. I should probably begin with a confession, which is that I too like Joe Biden. When I worked on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the late 70s and early 80s, Mr. Biden was a member of that committee. It was a committee that prided itself on its bipartisan attention to public policy issues. And frequently there was not a firm dividing line between Democrats and Republicans on issues of foreign policy and national security. In fact, I like to say that I started in the Senate during the Carter administration, and Jimmy Carter could not have gotten some major pieces of foreign policy legislation through the Congress without Republican support, and indeed Ronald Reagan could not have gotten foreign policy issues through the Congress without Democratic support. So it was a different era, and Mr. Biden was one of the people I was was proud to work with and for when I was on committee staff. If you ask the American people in the early 1960s, do you trust the government to do the right thing many or most times? The over 60% of the respondents would have said yes. If you ask that question today, only about 17%, according to the Pew polls, would give the affirmative answer that you can trust government to do the right thing many or most times. To a large extent, the constituency that both candidates are speaking to are the people who have not benefited from globalization and for the promises of the future, but most particularly Donald Trump. He is speaking to coal workers who no longer have jobs. He's speaking to people in the energy industry who feel they are going to lose their jobs if the climate agenda that Democrats support is enacted. He's speaking, I'm wearing a shirt, I'm wearing pants. I suspect neither are produced in the United States. So he's speaking to garment workers who no longer have jobs. Remember, I said at the outset, his constituency is white, white Americans, mainly male, without college degrees. These are people who feel government has not done anything for them that is good, and who have by government policies diminished their hopes for their future. And so this is an election about which one of these two individuals will better lead and better address the concerns of Americans who are now struggling. Democrats will say, with great justification, in my view, that's what the healthcare debate is all about. That the absence of healthcare by health insurance for many Americans is a fundamental flaw in our system, and that by addressing that, the attention can be paid to these Americans who are desperate for support at this point. But I think as you look at the significance, and I'll close with this, as you look at the significance of this election, you're talking about very different visions of the future. Democratic vision that argues that government has a substantial and growing role in the lives of Americans, and a Republican vision that is skeptical of the role of government. And we will see shortly which vision will predominate after November 3rd. Let me stop there.
Kaz, you've stopped at exactly the right minute. We're exactly on time. It's 10 o'clock here, and we have exactly 30 minutes for questions, which is what we planned. We have a couple of questions coming in over the Q&A link, and I encourage other listeners to submit questions through that link as we go forward. First question is from Indonesia. To all panelists, how confident are you in the integrity of the upcoming election, considering that the White House is hell-bent on delegitimizing mail-in voting, depriving the Postal Service of critical funding, and arguing that the only way the incumbent loses if the election is rigged, period. With the Republican senators closing ranks behind the president, is there still any hope that all votes will be counted, contrary to the president's wishes? Either one of you, and then I have a follow-on to that.
Shall I start?
Yep.
Sure.
Okay. First, thank you for an excellent question. And to my mind, this is the biggest question of the election. I am not particularly worried about American democracy if all votes were counted and if the American people actually came to a decision and that decision were reflected in which individual became president. My take would be, well, that's what democracy is all about, even if I disagree with it. Unfortunately, as the questioner very rightly points out, undermining the workings of the electoral system. We have several challenges interlocking. There is COVID, which will make it very difficult for people to get to the polls. There is the effort by the president to prevent mail-in balloting, which is a perfectly legal way to vote. It's how I am voting myself. It's how the president himself votes. But because mail-in ballots traditionally lean Democratic, his postmaster is actually even now implicated in a scandal about trying to impede this. We have the fact that according to our own intelligence agencies, by their public statements, Russia is at this moment attempting to interfere in the election in favor of Donald Trump. And we have the president having explicitly told his armed supporters to go to the polling places and watch them and to stand by, which sounds very much like an invitation to interfere with the electoral process. Add that to the Electoral College, which already has the tilt we've spoken about, and I'm quite concerned.
Do you want to add in, and then I will have a follow-up?
Yes. So let me reinforce everything that Jonah said. The position that is ascribed to Republicans is actually the position of one individual, Donald J. Trump. In fact, many Republicans are increasingly worried that the president's rhetoric is going to disadvantage them at the polls because they're fearful that Republicans will not vote because the president has said don't vote by mail, and they'll be worried that if they go to the polls, their health will be at risk. And so you've got, remember, this is an election not just about for the president of the United States, but for the House of Representatives and for 1/3 of the United States Senate. And so you have Republicans who are running for seats either in the House or the Senate who worry that in fact what the president is doing may disadvantage the Republican Party on election day. But as Jonah pointed out, the president of the United States has voted, and he voted by mail. And I sit here in Idaho and Utah, you only vote by mail, and that is a strongly Republican state. And Republican authorities in in Utah get on the television regularly and say, we've done voting by mail and it works very well, and we have absolutely no question whatsoever that it can be done safely and without any flaws in the system.
Thank you. I want to just add on to the question. I don't want to get into the really obscure details, but I think I'll ask Jonah first. Can you give us a flavor of what are the scenarios that might play out if state electoral college delegation counts are disputed, or have faithless electors rather, or even if states have differing reports of the count from the legislature, the governor, and other things, and what happens then? There's even a scenario I read in a recent book that somehow the House might choose the president, might choose the president.
Yes.
Jonah.
Yes. This is where it's important for people to understand that the American people do not elect their president. Under our Constitution, it is the Electoral College that elects the president, and there is nothing in the Constitution that says that the people have any role to play in this whatsoever. The Electoral College was not actually chosen by popular ballot until the early 19th century, and we could easily see one or more states going back to the system of state legislatures choosing their delegates to the Electoral College, either genuinely because COVID and all of these other issues we spoke about prevent an accurate ballot, or simply out of raw politics. Any place where there is, I'll limit it to the Republican states, just because nobody is really suggesting that this is going to happen in a Democratic-led state, but it could in theory as well. But for example, Florida and Arizona are two very important swing states. Both of them have Republican legislatures and Republican governors. There is nothing to stop either of these states from simply saying, we send our votes for Donald Trump. And at least according to many reads of the Constitution, that would be legal. So then when you get a number of these different competing ballots, because you could also have the same situation in a state that has a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor, and you have two sets of ballots. The faithless elector is another question I can get into, but it's not as frightening to me because it's just more unpredictable. Then it goes to the House of Representatives to decide, well, how does the Electoral College actually have voted? And there it gets even more complex, because the voting is not the same as for every other law, which would mean the Democrats have a majority. The voting is by state delegations. And right now, there are 26 delegations that are controlled by the Republicans, 23 controlled by the Democrats. So under the current Congress, it would be the Republicans who would have the power. But wait, there's more. It's not the current Congress that would decide this, because the new Congress gets sworn in on January 3rd, and the Electoral College votes are counted on January 6th. So it's the new Congress, which might have a different composition. And if they can't decide, then it goes to the Senate, which chooses the vice president, and it would be the new Senate that would decide. And if they can't decide, then if there is no president on January 20th, then Donald Trump's term ends and Mike Pence's term ends. That's written into the Constitution. The third person in line of succession is Nancy Pelosi. So that gives the Republicans in both the House and the Senate a very strong incentive to figure something out before January 20th.
And there's more, but
yes, there's a lot more.
as it gets too obscure. Yeah, Kaz, are you okay with that, or do you want to add in?
I think Jonah covered the possibilities very well. Let me just point out that we've been through this before in the 2000 election, Bush versus Gore. That election ultimately was decided by a decision of the Supreme Court. So we've had contested elections before. This would not be the first time. But what I think Jonah's recitation underlies for us, all of us are hoping for a landslide so that there's absolutely no confusion with the outcome. But it also points out that all of us normally sit up on election day and we're hopeful that by midnight we know who the winner is. But it may well be that with ballots, vote-in ballots coming in only on election day, are only being counted after election day, that we may not have a decision well into November.
Yes, I just add one thing. Kaz is absolutely right that we should all be assuming we won't have a decision on election day. Because of the mail-in ballots, in many cases, they don't even have to be received by law until 3 to 6 days after election day, as long as they're postmarked by election day, depending on the state. The key difference, in my view, between the 2000 election and this one is that in the 2000 election, Al Gore abided by the decision. He conceded. He had agreed that he had lost, which is what presidents normally or candidates normally do. And for what it's worth, I feel very confident that if Joe Biden loses, he will concede. It won't be on election day because the votes won't all be counted then. But once the votes are counted, he's not going to string this out. On the other hand, Donald Trump will. We know that because he told us he will. He's told us over and over again that he will not consider any election legitimate unless he wins. So I think we're going to be seeing not just legislation or not just litigation, because the Supreme Court will be brought in on a lot of lawsuits, but ultimately, it's quite possible that this will go to the House of Representatives because under the Constitution, that's really where the buck stops. They have the authority to decide which electoral college votes are legitimate and which ones are not. So this will ultimately be a political rather than a legal question. I'm hoping it doesn't get that far. I'm hoping that before that happens, whichever candidate has lost agrees that he has lost, but I wouldn't bet my mortgage on it.
Good idea. Question, I think from Indonesia, but question. Do you think that Vice President Biden should or will change his foreign policy to move closer to America first, in a sense, and thus capture some of the undecided or even capture some of Trump's supporters? Second, where do President Trump and Biden resemble and differ in terms of the Palestine issue?
Well, let's see. Since it asks about Joe Biden, and since I staffed him directly, shall I take the first crack at that?
You may, and then we'll like to hear from Kaz as well.
Okay, yes, definitely. First off, I do not think that Joe Biden is going to move towards Donald Trump foreign policy for electoral reasons or for personal reasons. I reiterate that I do not speak for him or speak for the campaign, but having staffed him for 9 years, I've got a pretty good sense of where he's coming from. In electoral terms, the American people are not going to be voting on the basis of foreign policy. And it wouldn't help him. And I just don't think that it would, I don't think he'd get any votes. If you were a MAGA voter or a Make America Great voter, you have your candidate. Why would you want a pale imitation of it when you can have the real thing? And it's just not, it's also just not really where his heart is. On the Palestine issue, I know a little bit about this too, because for a year I was his Middle East staffer. I got rid of that portfolio as soon as I could because the frustrations of dealing with that portfolio in the American system are legion. But there is a huge difference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump on the Palestine issue. Donald Trump has not even attempted, in my view, to be an honest broker or to try to bring about any kind of settlement that reflects the aspirations of the Palestinian people. I think we've seen that throughout his tenure, whether by moving the embassy to Jerusalem, which predetermines a settlement that excludes any kind of Palestinian capital in Jerusalem, or in various other ways. While Joe Biden has always made that a part of his strategy for Mideast peace, one can agree or disagree with where he came out on the Palestinian issue, legitimately agree or disagree, but he has always genuinely tried, and I think would try in the future, to at least come up with an equitable solution. With that, over to Kaz.
Yes.
So let me just pick up on Jonah's comments on Palestine. I think effectively President Trump has created new realities that a Biden administration would be forced to accept. And Jerusalem is moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem is an example of this. I can't imagine that a Biden administration would revisit that decision, leave our embassy in Jerusalem. It might reopen the closed consulate on the Palestinian territories. Obviously, I think a Biden administration would also support the recent move to have relations between diplomatic relations between Bahrain and the United Arab Republic and Israel. So there would be some element of continuity between a Biden administration and a Trump administration. I think a Biden administration, like every administration in recent memory, would be confronted with the question, do I want to expend political capital on working for a two-state solution when you have a rather discredited and old Palestinian leadership? I actually went as an election observer in the 2006 elections in the Palestinian territories. So a Biden administration would have to decide: do I want to expend political capital on this, or should I have other foreign policy priorities? And I suspect a Biden administration, unless there was a change of power both on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, would not want to do so.
Thank you. New question, although it's been touched on. How will the U.S. 2020 elections affect the universal value of democracy? It could arguably be said that the democratic value of democracy across the world has regressed, partly due to the recent political earthquake in the U.S. Since Trump was elected in 2016, more world leaders have turned into populist-like thinking, including Indonesia's President Jokowi. Seeing the current issues and polarization in the U.S. right now, how do the panelists see the state of democracy post-U.S. election? What lessons can be learned from the election for other democratic countries? Either can, Kaz, do you want to start?
Well, let me lead off on that. Freedom House each year does an assessment of whether freedom slash democracy has expanded or contracted during the year, and each year for the last 14 years, long predating the Trump administration, there has been according to Freedom House, a decline in world freedom, a rise in authoritarian values. I think it's fair to say that the United States, the world's oldest democracy, has not been and is not now in this election cycle a good exemplar of how a democracy should be functioning and functioning well. So I think we're looking at a rough road for democratic practices going forward. And in my judgment, at least, the first order of business for Americans is to get their own democracy right before we go and try and offer advice and guidance to others. We should be learning lessons from others, not preaching to them, and certainly not be preaching until we can get our own democracy shop at home in order.
I'd just like to
go
say
ahead.
I completely agree with Cass on that.
I think this one is probably easy, but let's go to it. America initiated the Marshall Plan for economic recovery after the end of World War II. Whoever is elected, do you think the U.S. will bring a new script such as the millennial version of the Marshall Plan to help countries post-COVID-19 and their recovery? What role will the U.S. should have during this pandemic situation, taking into account the transatlantic relations as they used to be have become fragmented or lack coherence? Either.
Kaz, why don't you start out for this one?
All right. So my fervent hope is that when and if Mr. Biden is elected, that his first order of business is to have the United States rejoin the World Health Organization. It's an absolute travesty that we got out of that. We should be back into it and exerting leadership within that setting. Second, whoever is elected, there is going to be an enormous fight on where taxpayer resources should be expended in the United States. We are adding, in response to COVID, trillions of dollars to the national debt. And presuming that in 2021, COVID is licked, both in the United States and around the world, the debate will then be where should the nation's resources be spent, and there the pressures are going to be huge to spend those resources on rebuilding the American economy and rebuilding the lives of American citizens.
Yes, I agree with Cass's analysis. I don't think that there will be much appetite in the U.S. political system for sending huge amounts of money overseas. Personally, I think this will be a mistake. I think that foreign assistance and foreign investment almost always helps America. Most Americans in polls think that foreign aid comprises up to 50% of the US budget. In actuality, it is a tiny fraction of that. Kaz may know the exact figure. I believe it's something more like 1%.
It's less than 1%.
Yeah. And in my view, and I've tried to put this forward and throughout my time in government, this is an investment. This is money very well spent. If you just look at COVID, this administration had U.S. CDC staff in Wuhan before COVID even existed, and it withdrew them. If not for that one action, the scope of the COVID pandemic might have been immeasurably reduced. The government of China covered up the COVID initial outbreak. It would not have been able to do that if the US CDC had not withdrawn its staffers. Once China admitted COVID and was willing to accept US aid in containing it, if the US had merely cooperated to the full extent possible, with money too, with money, with personnel, it was a case where we truly could have fought it over there rather than fighting it over here. So I think there are a lot of questions like that. And the next pandemic beyond COVID, because there will be one, we can either stamp it out before it becomes a global hazard, or we can wait until afterwards. My fear in my analysis is that we will wait until afterwards.
I'd like to work in one, actually a double-barreled question as our last question. The first is focused on the Affordable Care Act, and the second is focused on the president and the Republican Party. The first is, given that so many Americans are out of work due to the coronavirus, the Affordable Care Act has become an important health care to many families. Can you speak about why the Republican platform is so focused on repealing that act? You see this as a defining issue in the election? And the broader version, what do you attribute the tremendous hold that the president has on the current Republican Party to?
I'll let Cass field that, and I'll jump in with a few thoughts after. But
Yeah.
all yours, Cass.
So the answer to the first part of the question is yes, that the issue of health insurance is a defining issue in this election. And if you look at the advertising that Democrats are doing in each of the states where they're contesting either Senate seats or certainly in the presidential election, they are hammering Republicans on the issue of health care. It's worth noting that there is no Republican platform. There is only what the president says. And he keeps saying that he's got a health plan in his pocket, but he has yet to produce the health plan or indeed his income taxes. I think for the next 30 days, you are going to hear a lot about the Affordable Care Act, and Vice President Biden's position is that he is committed to it and committed to expanding it, expanding coverage for Americans who are without health insurance, and I suspect for many Americans that will be a defining aspect of the future. On the second part of the question, why Republicans are backing Trump, I think the Republican Party that I worked for back in the 1970s and 1980s is not the Republican Party that exists today. This Republican Party has become Donald Trump's party with characteristics that he has imposed upon the party. But Republicans find themselves in a difficult position. If they don't support the president, they risk losing the base that he appeals to. And then they're caught in between because we are so divided in such partisan ways that Democrats are not going to vote for Republicans. So if Republicans don't have strong base support, then they at the state level, then they can't win either. So you have someone like Senator Susan Collins, historically a moderate Republican in the state of Maine, who is running for re-election. She is behind in the polls, and she's left with this. She's constantly asked, you support the president on this issue or that, and she's left with a very, very real dilemma as to how to position herself given these circumstances.
Jonah, you have the last word.
Okay, well, first, thank you, David. Thank you, Cass. And thank you, USINDO, and thank you to the audience for giving us your time. On that last question, I think Cass really answered it very well, and I would add I'd add this as sort of as a coda. It's been very painful to me to see what has happened to the country of my citizenship, even though I've been living overseas for most of that time. And to be honest, I brought my family to Indonesia to live, in part because of these changes. I always knew that there were a certain number of my countrymen who wanted an America that was really only meant for people who looked like me. I didn't know they were 42% of the country. And that 42% was not really very well served by either the Democratic or the Republican Party. Now, I think that they shouldn't be very well served because my vision of America is not one that is just for people who look like me. But at least in my analysis, that's the cleavage that we're looking at now. A multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, or one that is basically an ethno-nationalist state where some people have full citizenship and some people are second-class citizens. And if it's the latter, that really excludes Democrats and traditional Republicans too. It has basically created a whole new party that is called the Republican Party now, but I've got dozens and dozens of friends and colleagues who have been good Republicans their whole lives and who do not feel comfortable in that setting. So where does that leave us? Where do we go from here? I don't really know, because it's not going to end with this election. The fact that 42% of the country feels this way means that even if Joe Biden is elected, those people are not going to vanish and they're not going to change their views. It's going to be a long, slow rebuilding if we're lucky. I'll end on a more upbeat note than that, though. So I'll just say that one of the good things about democracy is that it puts us out and it lets us wrestle with this through the political system rather than through violent civil war, which is the last way we settled this in America back in the 19th century. I hope that by bringing it out into the public and political arena, that we're able to hash through this and hopefully find a way of addressing the legitimate grievances of people among that 42%, and frankly, not addressing the illegitimate ones. And I think with that, maybe I'll end it.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank our two distinguished panelists for their insights, their balanced and wise views, which I knew would happen. I'd like to thank the audience for their questions, and I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to make this program timely and successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.